Hi guys, and welcome to a video that I am probably going to call something like Richard's Story. And what I'm going to do is essentially describe the Richard story so far. A number of people have started this Let's Play somewhere in the middle and they don't want to go back, but they do want to know, who is Richard and, where does he come from, how did he get here and all that type of thing. So I thought I would make this video where I try and describe the most essential things. Now, if you have sort of jumped into the middle of the Richard story, you should know that Richard actually looks reasonably healthy and heroic right now. I mean, he's certainly not the most handsome hero, and he isn't the most physically impressive, but he looks pretty capable now. But this was not always the case. In fact, when Richard started this quest, he was a skinny, bedraggled, and pretty much beaten down person. He was dirty, his hair hadn't been cut for a while, and he looked like he was suffering from malnutrition. He was about as skinny as a person could be without looking close to death. But he was also mentally unprepared for this. He was not some sort of adventurer, he was not a trained warrior or anything like that at all. He had no skills whatsoever that an adventurer would need because, in fact, he was a librarian, he was a scholar. So how did a skinny, ill-prepared scholar end up as the hero in my Let's Play Skyrim? Well, I actually did a prelude video. And honestly, if you are curious as to Richard's story, you should watch that. It's about 8 minutes long, and it will give you the backstory to this character. It will tell you how he got basically ready to have his head chopped off by a bunch of Imperials in Skyrim. So I'll put a link here. If you have not seen that, you should pause this video, click that link, and go and watch that. That is the beginning, the genesis of Richard. So what comes after that is, the first quest, the tutorial almost, where you are escaping Helgen, and I'm sure all of you've seen it or played it several times, and you pretty much know what to expect. Oh look!
What in oblivion is that?
It's a giant flying lizard that's going to breathe fire. Take a guess.
Dragon!
There you go! Richard did follow Ralof, the Stormcloak, because he is an admirer of the Stormcloaks, although not exactly agreeing with them on everything. He does agree with them that the Empire is rotten. It has lost its way, and siding with the Thalmor or banishing the worship of Talos was wrong. Even though Richard himself is not a worshipper, he is a massive admirer of Tiber Septim, the man. So he escapes with Ralof, and something pretty much starts to happen from the get-go. His companion Ralof kind of suggests that Richard should join the Stormcloaks and says they need strong warriors like you, that type of comment. And, Richard was pretty amazed and just assumed that Ralof had been hit on the head or something. Because, of course, Richard's a skinny scholar, and as far as he's concerned, he doesn't look strong in the slightest. However, you start getting a glimpse at Richard's character when you get to the Guardian Stones, where he pretends to take the Warrior Stone because he doesn't want to disappoint Ralof. But then he runs back and takes the Thief's Stone because he really does want that benefit. He is going to try and avoid trouble rather than get into fights. But you see this slight desire to not let Ralof down. The second episode starts in Riverwood, and Richard has cut his hair slightly. He has cut it, he wants a little bit of a change of image. He is on the run after all, and he's a little bit at a loss for things to do. I mean, he doesn't know what to do, but his plan is to try and find a job of some type to sustain himself and lie low so that the Thalmor don't find him. He's convinced the Thalmor are scouring the world to find him. In actual fact, they're not. He's a minor issue for them. But Richard doesn't know that, and so he agrees to go to White Run and deliver a message regarding the dragon to the Jarl. Now on the way, Richard spots a battle going on. A battle between some humans and a giant. And although he never really thought about it at the time, Richard went running over to help. Richard actually went in to fight. Now honestly, I don't actually think Richard helped all that much in the fight. I think he got one shot off, but it shows his mentality. It shows something about him that you wouldn't have expected of a simple scholar. He jumped right in the fight. And the companions, the people that he was helping, seemed to recognize this. Several of them commented on how he looked strong enough and he should join the companions, and he was totally confused and just thought they were all mad. Why do they think he looks strong? He's the skinniest, weakest person he's ever known. To Richard, warriors are these strong, muscle-bound people, but of course the companions knew better. Now after this incident, Richard carries on and goes and finds the Jarl, gives him the message, and he's still hoping to try and get a job. And he ends up meeting the wizard, the court wizard, and they seem to treat him as if he's some sort of expert on dragon, because basically running away from one makes you an expert. But Richard thought to himself, well, this is a job I could do. I could study lore of dragons and become an expert at it and be useful and safe. But he ends up getting roped into the quest where he has to go off and find the stone tablet. So he becomes a bit of an archaeologist, somewhat reluctantly. But again, he does it. He goes along with it. And of course, once he finally gets back with the tablet after actually surviving Bleakfall Barrows, the dragon attacks, and the Jarl sends him off with Irileth. Again, Richard is completely baffled as to what he is doing with these people, but he does it anyway. There's something in him that is just pushing him to not disappoint people, but also a sort of curiosity. And so he goes off and he helps battle the dragon, and you guys know what happens. He helps kill it. He doesn't really kill it himself. I believe it was Irileth that does the killing. And he was more of a bystander, just sending arrows in the general direction. But of course, at the end of that fight, he absorbs the dragon's soul. He's a little confused as to what happened, but apparently the Greybeards are not, and they summon him. And so, of course, he goes back to the Jarl and he's told, he doesn't get the news he wants, which is, you have a job, here's your room. He gets told he's got to go off and speak to the Greybeards. And again, Richard agrees to do it. Common sense would have said at this point, you just run off and hide somewhere, build yourself a small camp somewhere and just ride this out for the next 10 years. But he doesn't. Curiosity is pushing him along. He's been summoned by the Greybeards and they're going to tell him what happened. And of course, you guys know that the rest of that part of the story. He gets told that he's Dragonborn. He is like Tiber Septim. And you can imagine, to someone who, reveres Tiber Septim so much, this is a pretty amazing revelation. And so, for a variety of reasons, whether it's, curiosity or even ego, and perhaps just some sort of feeling of being dragged along on the whim of destiny, Richard sets out to find this horn and to find words and to master the way of the voice, to save Tamriel from the threat of dragons. And he realizes he's totally unfit for the task at hand. Learning the way of the voice apparently is going to involve lots of physical danger before he ever gets even close to that far. And so he decides to go back to White Run and talk to the companions who suggested that he should join them. And he does. He goes along and says, I need to learn to fight. I need you to turn me into a warrior. And of course, the harbinger of the companions, Kodlak, he sees something in Richard. He says as much. He says there is a strength within him. And so obviously he realizes there is more than meets the eye with Richard. And so Richard joins the companions and starts learning the ways of the warrior. Now, if you want to see how that worked out, you might want to stop this video and go and watch part 11 of chapter 1. I will put a link here. It is a very short episode. It's 14 minutes long, which caught a lot of people by surprise, but I ended it at a very poignant point. So if you don't want to hear the spoiler now, if you want to stop the video, go off and watch that, it might be worth it. However, if you've not, or you've just come back after watching it, this is the episode where the reality of what is going on hits home to Richard. When he gets into a fight with a dragon, and obviously he's taking it seriously, he's scared half to death, and he's trying to kill the dragon, but 2 farmers get killed. And they probably get killed because while he was trying to drag the dragon off somewhere easier to fight where he had cover, the farmers stupidly ran in there and fought it directly, and they got killed. And this had a fairly profound effect on Richard. He began to see that this was not some fable, this was not some story, it wasn't some bard's song. It was real, and people died, and it really hit him very, very hard. He felt, responsible. He felt responsible, and he began to see the true magnitude of the task ahead of him and why it was so important. And it did change him. It did change him. But he continued on with the companions and eventually became part of the inner circle. He was made a werewolf. He had mixed feelings about this. Because obviously this is, you're taking on the form of a beast. However, the power it gave was... It wasn't that he was attracted to the power exactly, although maybe a little. It was the recognition that he needed that power. He needed the strength of the werewolf to basically go on. He was not strong enough without the beast within. And then, of course, the inevitable death of Kodlak, and Ayla sends him off to do revenge on the Silver Hand. And this is where things really begin to change for Richard. The rage and the potential for violence that was hinted at in the prelude comes to full force at this point. Richard just lets it all out. He doesn't need to be drunk and black out to let it out. He just lets it out completely. I actually did a kind of interlude called A Werewolf's Warning, where I was trying to convey the feelings that Richard had, this cold anger, the sort of anger that doesn't come out screaming, but that is just totally focused, just preparing for the battle ahead as he was looking down on the base of the Silver Hand and, preparing to kill them all. And that is actually well worth watching. It gives you a little bit of the feeling that was Richard at that point, and perhaps even part 30, which is only an 8-minute video, and that is Richard releasing the beast and going mad and killing everybody and enjoying it. I mean, this is the thing. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed killing these people. And in the aftermath of that slaughter, Richard began to realise that Kodlak had been right in warning the dangers of the beast and this sort of desire to cure himself of the werewolf curse or gift, depending on how you look at it. And Richard began to realise that Kodlak was probably right, that this was a curse, that it did facilitate the worst in our own nature. But he also accepted that for now he needed the power it brought, and that he was going to shoulder that burden for a while longer. In actual fact, if you want to go and watch the very last episode of that chapter, which is where they go off and they free Kodlak's soul, so that he can, go to Sovngarde. And at the end, Richard is reflecting upon what he has learned. And he gives a speech, basically, at the end. And he's reflecting upon the fact that he's learned so much more than he ever thought he would. What he needed to learn was not just how to fight, not just how to survive, but how to rely on other people and how to lead them. Because one of the things that had occurred since the death of Kodlak was this transition where the companions had started listening to Richard and following his lead. And it turns out that's what Kodlak wanted, and that Richard took over the companions. Even though he was the weakest of them all, they still looked to him for leadership, and that people had been right to see strength in Richard. Now, at this point, Richard was actually looking a little better as well. He was looking a little more physically capable. He was still a small man. I mean, he was still, pretty skinny. But he looked skinny in a kind of long-distance runner look rather than a, starving person. And this was because of a mod I'd made specifically for this series called Pumping Iron, that as you train, it does build muscle. And so Richard was beginning to look a little bit more the part. And at the end of chapter 1, he'd also donned some war paint for the final episodes, although he lost that for the next chapter. But in actual fact, chapter 1 is the chapter where we discovered Richard. For obvious reasons, he was a complete unknown. And he was also, not an adventurer, not a warrior, and so this was the chapter that changed him. This was the chapter that moulded him into the hero we see now. I mean, he's become stronger in the following chapters. He's grown a little, and, found new companions, had lots of adventures, but in actual fact, since the end of chapter 1, he's been the Richard you see now in personality. I mean, he's still irritable, he's still sarcastic, he's not exactly a people person, but he is an accomplished warrior now. He can, he can kill bandits quite easily, trolls don't give him any trouble anymore, and, he's quite willing to go off and fight dragons without being in a total panic all the time. Realistically, chapter 1 is where Richard was born, and I don't mean the baby Richard, but Richard that you see today was born. Chapter 1 was the painful birthing process that produced our current hero. Chapter 2 was actually the Dragonborn DLC, and if you've played that, you pretty much know what happened, and there was very little in it that was unexpected. As I said, Richard continued to grow as a warrior, and at the end of it, had discovered how to make Stalrim armor, which seems to now be his signature look. Believe it or not, spent quite a lot of time trying different armors, and none of them really quite suited him. And the Stalrim armor, as long as you don't use the helmet, plus the cloak, really does seem to capture the essence of Richard, and that's probably the look he's going to keep till the end now. Oh, and at the end of that chapter, he also had grown some whiskers. He'd stopped shaving while he was over there, so he looks a little rougher now. In actual fact, the whiskers and the weight he's put on definitely make Richard look a little bit more manly. But at the end of that chapter, he comes home, he comes back to Skyrim. Chapter 3 is continuing on with the main quest. He gets back to Windhelm, and he's travelling back to White Run to get all his stuff, get his gear together, and then he's going to go off and find Delphine and continue on that quest. However, it takes a lot longer to get home than he thought, because he kept having run-ins with dragons, and the dragons were absolutely kicking his ass. I mean, he was in so much. He had to run away from one fight and go back and kill it later on when he was better prepared. So chapter 3 was a bit of a realization that he was still completely ill prepared for dragons, and so he definitely went off to see Delphine with an attitude of, I definitely need to find a way to kill these because they're still too strong for me. And she of course sent him off to the Thalmor embassy, and you can imagine the fun he had there. and that led to freeing Esbjörn, and we ended chapter 3 back in Riverwood. Esbjörn and Delphine agreeing that they needed to go off and find Alduin's wall in the Skyhaven Temple, and Richard said he would meet them there. Now, of course, I also did a Falskar playthrough in between there, but again, if you know Falskar, if you've seen a Let's Play of it or played it yourself, you can pretty much guess what happened there. But when he finished, he went back to Skyrim, and unfortunately, as he arrived on the docks of Skyrim, near Dawnstar, he heard a dragon and also felt the beast within begin to well up. So he realised he had a dragon to fight, and about 20 seconds before he turned into a werewolf in front of the people of Dawnstar. In the prelude, you see how he manages to get that. If you've not seen the prelude for chapter 4, I will leave a link here, and you can see how Richard managed to get out of that little conundrum. But he was last seen in werewolf form, making the journey to Riverwood, where he would once more take up the quest to stop Alduin the World Eater and kill as many Thalmor as possible.